Hey everyone. So I just had a discussion with the guys from the Five on the Floor podcast about the Heat's upcoming off season, and you can check out the link, it's in the description. And I just wanted to go a little deeper on the things we talked about. Mainly, we discussed Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo's potential extensions, what Caleb Martin and Haywood Highsmith's next contract will look like if they're brought back, and the possibility of acquiring Donovan Mitchell. But if he's available, can the Heat even acquire him while abiding by some of the new CBA restrictions in regards to trades and the apron levels? And even if they do get him, then the Heat would have three max players. Is that even sustainable? And how would it impact the depth, the level of depth on the roster? So I'm going to get into all those things in this video. So here's the Heat's payroll so far heading into next season. They have nearly a full roster, and their payroll's already pretty high. They're slightly into the tax and over the first apron. So I already went ahead and declined Caleb Martin's $7 million player option. I think he's going to get huge offers. So I'm a little skeptical that he will even resign him, since doing so would for sure take them over the second apron. Right now, they're projected to be 7.6 million below it. The other more significant free agent is Haywood Highsmith, who I could see being back depending on his price, but also like Martin, I wouldn't be surprised if he's let go as well. And because of their quest to trade for a star guard, they will not want to exceed the second apron. They'll need to stay below it to successfully acquire one. With that said, I would not expect them to use any of their existing trade exceptions or dip into their mid-level exception as well for the same reasons. However, their offseason ends up playing out, though, I think there's a strong chance that they enter the season with this level of payroll. So Jimmy Butler has two different types of extensions he could do, but they're both pretty similar. The first would be to decline that $52.4 million player option and add 2 years for $113 million. The other one is to pick up that option and then add 1 year for just under $60 million. In either extension, he could only extend through the 2027 season, in which he'd be 38, and both are pretty identical in money and total dollar amount, so it doesn't really matter which one he takes if offered. And at this stage in his career, since he would be 38 in that additional year, he should definitely take it if 100% offered. Now, there's definitely been a lot of speculation recently about his future in Miami, especially with Pat Riley's recent comments. And maybe they're already starting to think ahead about the post-Jimmy Butler era. He's already been linked to the Sixers recently. They're in pursuit of a star. I'm sure they'd give him a fourth year if they could. But he's constantly defied regression, especially with last year's playoff run. And I thought the last extension that he signed 3 years ago with the Heat, I thought that wasn't going to age well, but he just willed them back to the finals. And, you never know. Maybe he could still live up to it. I'm not sure if he gets an extension now, but at the same time, I can't imagine he gets traded. It seems like he wants to be there. The Heat and Jimmy Butler are such a perfect fit together. And I'm sure they'll work. Now, Bam Adebayo is also extension eligible, and I think his situation is far more interesting. So he can extend this offseason for up to 3 years, $166 million, would pay him an average of $55 million a year. Might seem like a lot of money, but there's a good chance he might even pass on it and wait a year before extending. And that's because he could still be Supermax eligible if he either makes All-NBA or wins Defensive Player of the Year, which it's definitely in the realm of possibility. He just placed third this year, which is the highest he ever placed. So he's close, but also Victor Wembanyama just entered the league. But if he does qualify, he'd be able to earn the Supermax, which is projected at 5 years, $346 million for him, which is an average of $70 million a year versus the 55 in the other extension I just listed. However, if he does qualify for this, he doesn't need to get the full amount. He could get somewhere in between the two extensions, which would be similar to what the Jazz did with Rudy Gobert when he qualified. Either way, he's looking at a significant raise, and that, along with their pursuit of an additional star, could really complicate their payroll like 2 years from now once that extension kicks in. And those two things could really factor in towards however they may feel about Jimmy in the future. If he does come back, I could see him getting something like 3 for $54 million, which is very similar to what the Lakers gave Rui Hachimura last year. Now, maybe he won't even need to get this high, since most of the teams that could make an offer for him would really only have the mid-level exception offer, which starts at just under 13 million. And maybe you got a cap space team that can give him a pretty expensive front-loaded short-term offer. But as far as those mid-level offers, maybe he just need to top that, which isn't too hard to do. They have his bird rights. However, I seriously doubt that he even want to go that high, let alone even the mid-level. One, they have Jaime Jaquez now and Nikola Jovic. I'm sure they're very confident in them that they're going to be good enough to be the types of player they need at the wing. But also, they just always done such a good job finding players like Caleb Martin on the margins. And I think they will probably feel confident in their ability to do it again. Now, Haywood Highsmith, on the other hand, I could see the Heat bringing him back. I could see him getting around taxpayer mid-level type offers, starting around $5 million a year. So I could see the Heat topping that to try to keep him. It's similar to what Kenrich Williams, Trey Lyles are getting backup four type of money, and similar to what the Heat just paid Caleb Martin. So I do think they're slightly more likely to bring him back than Martin. But again, they could just equally let him go and try to identify the next currently undervalued player to occupy that rotation spot. As you may have heard, Donovan Mitchell has been linked to the Heat. So let's say he really wants to be there and the Cavs like what the Heat have to offer. The Heat would have to do two things to successfully acquire him. Number one, they'd have to send out more salaries than they're taking back. If the Heat trade for a star like Donovan Mitchell, they would have three max players between him, Jimmy Butler, and Bam Adebayo. And they also have two other pretty high-paid starters between who they don't trade, like Terry Rozier and Duncan Robinson potentially. They would need to stay over the first apron because that extra $11 million in wiggle room between the two apron levels would help a lot for the Heat towards keeping that high level of depth. And then number two, they need to aggregate players to get to that amount of money that Donovan Mitchell makes. And that would hard cap them to the second apron, which they're not going to go over anyways. So the only thing is they'd have to make sure that they could field the roster, getting up to 14 players, staying below the second apron. So here's the type of offer I could see happening. All three of these players, Tyler Hero, Jaime Jaquez Jr., Josh Richardson, assuming he opts in, which I think he will, they all combine to exceed Donovan Mitchell's $35.4 million. So they could stay over the first apron after doing this trade. They also have two first-round picks they could trade, their 2024 first-round pick and either their 2030 or 2031 first-round pick, and I would assume that both would have to be included as well. Here would be the Heat's payroll after making that trade, with the addition of Donovan Mitchell and the subtraction of Tyler Hero, Jaime Jaquez, Josh Richardson, and Caleb Martin not coming back. The Heat can field the roster while staying below the second apron, just below it. They might even have enough flexibility to re-sign Haywood Highsmith, if that's enough for him, or they could use the $5.2 million taxpayer mid-level to add somebody else. But for now, I just put in Highsmith with that projected amount I laid out earlier. Now, at this point, I do think that they would have to split their backcourt a little bit, particularly one of Terry Rozier or Duncan Robinson. I would definitely try to trade them. Maybe if you have another pick left over, to try to get a legitimate front court starter. If that's not possible, then maybe you can just try to salary dump one of them or just take back a lot less salary to at least regain more flexibility and re-sign Caleb Martin. I now have him making a higher salary because he can opt out and then sign up to the max for up to 30% of the salary cap. And I gave Haywood Highsmith that same projection I gave out earlier. So they'd go into the season slightly over the second apron, but just close enough after fielding the rest of the roster that they can get below it later. I'm sure they'd even be below it heading into the season if they haven't traded one of their guards by then. Now, here's a three max player distribution that they have. They got Jimmy Butler making the 35% max. Donovan Mitchell's is worth 30% of the salary cap, and Bam Adebayo is worth 25% of the salary cap. So because of that distribution, they are able to keep a pretty high level of depth heading into this season. And the expenses are not that high. Like $55 million a year luxury tax bill is not that high anymore, relatively speaking. And so it's much more tenable, at least for this season, than what the Phoenix Suns are doing, where they're paying Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal all 35% maxes of the salary cap. Now, beyond this season, that's when things get way more complicated, and they could head into the 2026-27 season well into the second apron and with a much significantly higher luxury tax projection. And that's because that's when Bam Adebayo's next extension is going to kick in, whether 30% or more. So now you're talking about getting closer to the Phoenix Suns type situation. So if the Heat have three players after this season earning $50 million plus, that's when they could look to potentially scale things down a bit. Really, though, I don't think the Heat have enough to acquire a guy like Donovan Mitchell. And as I went over in my Cavs video that came out yesterday, I ultimately feel that Donovan Mitchell will end up signing some sort of extension with the Cavaliers. So you might think, well, if the Heat aren't going to trade for a star, then they might as well try to address the front court. Try to trade one of your backcourt players that are making a lot of money for a player that can legitimately start at the four if you're not bringing back Caleb Martin. At the same time, I also could see the Heat just mostly running it back, and it might feel frustrating and that they're not making any progress, but it always seems to work. They just end up finding guys that fit in the rotation really well and end up winning 45 plus games for that season. And make sure to watch or listen to the conversation I had on the Five on the Floor podcast. And make sure to follow or subscribe to them if you're looking for some great Heat content.